All right, we are live. What's up, guys? Welcome to the Fresh Air Podcast. I'm here, Cory Hughes. We're going to go ahead and cover the JFK assassination 61st year anniversary. Let's get into it, guys. All right, we're back. What's up, guys? Welcome to the Fresh Air Podcast, man. We are live. Welcome. Today we got a very important episode, as you guys know. Today is the November 22nd, today's November 22nd, 2024. But we are going to be covering an event that went down November 22nd, 1963, 61st year anniversary. I'm here with Cory Hughes, the author of A Warning from History. This is a great book, man. Covers the JFK assassination in detail. We covered this a couple months back. But don't worry, we're going to go ahead and give you guys a full recap and go ahead and go into some new information that Cory's recently stumbled upon. And obviously, I think this is the biggest cover-up in American history, so I'm excited to be able to do this podcast, and to do it on such a day is a blessing. So, Cory, welcome to the show, man. Can you introduce yourself to the people?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. My name is Cory Hughes, and I've been a full-time Kennedy investigator since July of 2018. I really started with history in about 2015. I spent several years on World War II and a lot of the misconceptions that surround World War II. And that's, if you do it correctly, will inevitably lead you to the doorstep of Kennedy and the Kennedy assassination. And so once I got to Kennedy, really, it became a passion, the thing I'm most passionate about in my entire life. I can't seem to get enough. And the research that I'm going to share later on today, that I've been working on the past couple months, is really the extension of the work of another researcher named John Armstrong. And so it's really fascinating looking at the life of Lee Harvey Oswald and his time in the Marines and all the things that led up to the Kennedy assassination. One thing I have to emphasize is that the story of Lee Harvey Oswald and the story of the Kennedy assassination are two genuinely, completely separate stories that just so happen to intersect in Dallas in the book depository on November 22nd, 1963. So it is most certainly the most important event in American history and possibly world history, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah. And it's something that, people have tried to forget about, but, I think it's very important people understand this because if you understand the Kennedy assassination, you understand a lot of things about American culture, you understand who really runs this country. And there's many hands that were involved, right? There's many hands in the cookie jar that led to his assassination. But I think, we went through it on the last episode. It was a 4-hour-long podcast, guys. We went over it. Timestamps are there. You can absolutely go ahead and go back and watch that. But obviously today we're going to go ahead and reveal some of the new information. But we understand that a lot of you guys might have not saw the first episode. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of recap. And what we can do is kind of recap with the official story and then get into what we talked about last time, who the shooters were. Yes, there's more than one shooter, guys. A lot of you guys think, oh, yeah, it was just Oswald by himself acting alone. That's the official narrative that they tell you. But once Cory breaks it down, you'll see that it was impossible for that to happen. And it was far more nefarious than the American government wants to let on. I mean, there's a reason why they've been talking about declassifying the JFK documents, and Trump hasn't done it. In his last term, he said that he was going to do it. He didn't do it. He famously said, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't declassify it either. And a lot of the stuff that he's scared to reveal to you guys, Cory's going to talk about. So, Cory, if you don't mind kind of just taking us through the official narrative real quick for those that might be unaware.
Sure. The official narrative is that Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, and that his motivations were based purely around the fact that he was a communist. And when you look at the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, you will find that Lee Harvey Oswald did tend to talk about communism going back to a time when he was 13 or 14 years old, at a time when he couldn't possibly understand the concepts at which he tried to discuss with people. The official story doesn't make any sense, because the major criticism of Kennedy around the world really was that he was soft on communism. And the people most angry with him were people who were considered in the time right-wingers. And so for a extreme left-winger to assassinate Kennedy is a story that doesn't make any sense, that to this very day, they keep trying to get us to believe. And one thing that you will find out is that the assassination is far more nuanced than what I consider to be the official conspiracy theory, which is that the CIA killed Kennedy because they wanted to continue the war in Vietnam and Kennedy was going to end the war in Vietnam. That's the official conspiracy theory, which I promise was disseminated by the CIA, right? So blaming themselves for something for the wrong reason is not outside the depths of their psychological warfare. And one thing that you really need to understand in order to understand Kennedy is what psychological warfare is. Because the stories of Kennedy we've been told over the years about Lee Harvey Oswald being a communist and that's why he killed Kennedy, that is propaganda, and propaganda comprises a psychological warfare campaign against us. So as you dig deep into the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, it will inevitably lead you to the suspicions that the forces that created him as a person began long before the assassination, and that while a lot of people like to attribute MK Ultra type mind control to aspects of the Kennedy assassination, there are much simpler explanations that make much more sense. Like, what depths would they go to get a spy into the Soviet Union, right? And that, I find, is the core of the Oswald story. It's a very simple spy story that evolves over time and eventually will be repurposed. Everything kind of outlives its usefulness after a while. And that's where Oswald was. After he had gone to the Soviet Union as ultimately a false defector, most likely under one of two programs, either Redskin or AE Balcony, which were the primary programs that were operating at the time.
Real quick, Cory. Guys, give me ones in the chat if the audio is good. I see in the chat some of you guys are saying the audio is a little bit low. I just turned my audio up. It should be good now. Cory, his audio matters the most. So just make sure you guys give me ones if Cory's audio is good. Mine should be good too, but give me one if both of them are good. Because I really want to make sure that you guys understand what's going on here. Go ahead, chat. Go ahead. FNF chat, Fed Reacts chat. Give me ones if the audio is good. I turned my mic up, so it should be better now. Okay. All right. I see a bunch of ones. All right. Sweet. Okay. So continue on, Cory. I'm sorry.
All right. So when you move past the story of Oswald and you dissect the lies we've been told about Oswald, and even when you peel back the layers of the onion surrounding his ultimate role as an agitator in New Orleans, his going out and distributing flyers on the streets that said "Fair Play for Cuba Committee." These are the acts of an agitator. Professing communism is the act of an agitator. But I can't really find a reason for his agitation prior to their starting the planning of the Kennedy assassination. And so everything about Oswald just screams as though he had outlived his usefulness, and therefore he made the perfect patsy. I feel they felt like they could tie up a lot of loose ends all at once for multiple projects, because as we'll see later on, Oswald was most certainly involved in intelligence activities long before he even joined the Marines. Mm-hmm. So the fingerprints of intelligence in Oswald's life stretch all the way back to 1947, believe it or not, long before there was even a Kennedy or anything like that for them to plan around. And everything ultimately, like I said before, boils down to what will the CIA do to get a spy in the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, right?
And on screen right now, I actually have a picture of Oswald so they understand, because this is the person that everyone says was the person that killed Kennedy. He acted alone. This is what the Warren Commission ended up finding out. This is what they assumed. And, from what you're saying, because I think Oswald had went on a game show and identified himself as a Marxist-Leninist, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, he was interviewed on WDSU television shortly after his arrest on August the 9th of 1963. So he's handing out flyers on the street corner in New Orleans that say Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Mm-hmm.
However, allegedly, several days prior to that, he had met with a Cuban exile named Carlos Brunier. And allegedly, he goes to Carlos Brunier and tries to offer him his services on how to train Marines, because he was a Marine. He wanted to train troops to do invasions of Cuba and stuff like that. I don't believe Oswald ever actually did that. That was obviously somebody else creating this incident. When the cops arrested Oswald after this fight with Brunier, even the cops said he felt the whole thing was staged. Nothing about it seemed authentic. Mm-hmm. So they were setting Oswald up basically and doing everything they could to get him on television, to get him known by the local police. By the time the Kennedy assassination rolled around, they wanted to make sure that everybody in New Orleans knew who this guy was. And then what I see as part of the psychological operation that was happening at the same time, because impersonating someone is an act of psychological warfare. It's an act of tradecraft. In setting Oswald up in this manner, they needed everyone. He had to have a reputation already, right? And the reputation would then be borne out by all kinds of witnesses, and then more witnesses would come out of the woodwork, and that's exactly what happened. The FBI was overwhelmed with witnesses, and they ultimately ended up discarding a vast majority of the statements that came to them. And who knows what they even discarded, right? Because right now we have 5 million pages of documents, and I feel like that is probably only a fraction of all the stuff that came forward. Now, in as far as the documents that they're withholding, I believe that all the documents they're withholding really revolve around Oswald, but we've been distracted to think that there's some hidden gem connecting to the CIA that will give us all these answers. The personnel files in the CIA are really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in personnel files on Ted Shackley, George Joannidis, David Morales, all three guys in Dealey Plaza. They were all members of the JM Wave station out of Miami. So the CIA is not allowed to operate in America, but they do. And in 1963, the largest CIA station in America, which wasn't supposed to be here, was in Miami. It was called the JM Wave station. And it handled somewhere around 30,000 agents. So a lot of the stuff that they're hiding, I think, will revolve around the CIA's illegal activities in America and other covert operations that don't necessarily have to do with Kennedy. And I feel like if they release the few Kennedy documents that are remaining, particularly on David Morales and the personnel files, that will be like opening up Pandora's box, and then they'll have to explain a lot of things that they don't want to have to explain. And so that's what I think the real secret is. Not even that it has to do with the Kennedy assassination, but all those documents will lead to other things that will basically sink the CIA in most people's minds if it hasn't been already.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of that stuff is uncovered already in Doug Valentine's books. If you're not familiar with Doug Valentine, his books on the CIA he's the world expert on the CIA. A lot of that stuff is probably in his books already.
So I went ahead, I pulled up JM Wave for them here, and it actually, even in Wikipedia, says it was the code name for the major secret United States covert operation intelligence gathering station operated by the CIA from 1961 until 1968. So we kind of went over the official narrative, we went over it, Oswald was acting alone. He shot him from the book depository in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963, killed the president, around lunchtime, noon, with what kind of rifle was it? It was an Italian rifle.
It was a Carcano. 6.5 millimeter.
Boom.
Everyone says it's a piece of junk, and it kind of was a piece of junk. But really, that rifle was never used. And the rifles that were used, I believe, are already out there in the literature. Mostly the Mausers that were used by 3 of them. And then you have a Johnson, which was used by Loran Hall, which was immediately traced back to Los Angeles, and a guy named Richard Hathcock, right? So we have, over the years, there's been a ton of information released, but then it just doesn't get acknowledged. It doesn't get acted on,
Yeah. So now that we went over kind of like what the official narrative was and how it just doesn't make sense because Kennedy was trying to make peace with the Russians. Obviously, Oswald was a somewhat communist. Like, it wouldn't make sense for him to assassinate him when Kennedy actually was one of the few presidents in U.S. history that was trying to make peace with Russia. Now, I guess let's debunk some of the claims, right? And then we'll get into what actually happened. A lot of people say, right, Alex Jones claims it was because he was going to get us off the gold standard, right? It was Executive Order 11 something. I forget the exact numerical code for it.
Right.
Other people say it was because he was going to pull us out of Vietnam. Other people say it was the La Cosa Nostra, it was the mafia. Other people say it was because they had paid it for his campaign and then he turned his back on them and didn't help them out, right? With the unions, everything else like that. Then some other people say, oh, it was strictly the CIA. If you watch the movie JFK, the 1992 film, you know, they pretty much put all the blame on the CIA, right? And then other people that are a bit more base, like me and you and others, understand that there's obviously a very deep Israeli connection as well. But can you kind of go over and debunk a lot of I think the Vietnam and this executive order are the two main ones that they use to say that's why, and the mafia are the main ones that they say that Kenny needed to be killed. But can you kind of go over that real quick and debunk these claims?
Sure. So the notion that Kennedy was going to pull out of Vietnam it's really kind of ridiculous. If you look at how Kennedy was spending money, he had no intention of pulling out of anything. He had spent within the past 10 months prior to the assassination, somewhere in the neighborhood of $6.5 billion on helicopters, airplanes, logistics. And that's the equivalent of around $65 billion today, maybe a little more. That's an unheard of amount. That's commitment. You're not pulling out of any war like that. The memo in regards to reallocation of troops. Now, recently in studying what's known as the ZR Rifle Files, which is the government, it's really a cover in the modern day, the cover of their assassination programs, the executive action programs. But when you dig through the files on that, you'll find one paragraph that basically the CIA acknowledges that Kennedy was attempting to put pressure on DM. For what purpose? I couldn't tell you. To do what the CIA wanted, right? And so I guess he didn't do what they wanted. And
you said on DM? On who DM is?
DM was the president of South Vietnam.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So ultimately him not doing what the CIA wanted resulted in DM being killed, right? And so they attempted to link that to the ZR Rifle program, which ZR Rifle was a recruitment program. And it employed two covert operatives named QJ Win. Okay. Most people haven't figured out that QJ Win wasn't a single operative. He was two operatives, and that those operatives were Otto Skorzeny, who was Hitler's bodyguard and elite SS member who basically Hitler loved and thought he was the best soldier in the German army. And then you have Jean-Pierre Lafitte, who was the other QJ Win. One operated out of Madrid, and the other one was heavily operating out of the Corsican region in France. But Jean-Pierre Lafitte, ultimately, I believe and I believe I have a document to substantiate this, although it is using aliases. I believe Jean-Pierre Lafitte he did what he was supposed to do under ZR Rifle, and he recruited the assassin who ultimately was on the Grassy Knoll, which initially was handled by Santos Trafficante. And the person we're talking about, I might as well just say it, is Jack Valenti. Jack Valenti was the shooter on the Grassy Knoll. And when you dig into Valenti's background, it turns out he's born into multiple mob families, the DeGeorge family and the Valenti family. I can't find the direct familial connections through the genealogy, but you can't always trust that stuff. A lot of that's manipulated. But I do know that down in Tampa, Florida, there was a guy named Andrea Valenti out of Tampa who participated in the assassination of Anton Cermak in 1933, was it? Down in Miami. People say it's the attempt on Roosevelt that got Cermak killed, but no, it was an actual assassination of Cermak. The target was not Roosevelt. The patsy in that case was a guy named Giuseppe Zangara. And so when Zangara was arrested, he was arrested with a guy who worked for Santos Trafficante Sr., and his name was Andrea Valenti. And he was also arrested there was another guy with him named Stephen Valenti, although they claimed not to be related. There's zero information on Stephen Valenti, but Andrea Valenti you can trace back to Santos Trafficante Sr. And so Jack Valenti most certainly has, and Jack Valenti, I'm sorry, there's Valenti family that is connected. There are other families connected, like the Dinersteins and the Calderones, particularly to the Valenti family. And when you study the Tampa mob back in the day, those names all circulate around Andrea Valenti. And that tells me that these people are all related, right? So the FBI investigated Jack Valenti and his mob background, but of course, they squashed all the information that they found on him. And there's tons out there. There's tons of information that you can use to link him directly to the remnants of the Houston Mafia, which by the time of the Kennedy assassination was pretty much defunct. All the Texas Mafia that they were attempting to pull together, because Texas was kind of an open state, anybody could kind of get a piece of it, but they started to form a mafia in Houston in the 30s and 40s, and also in Dallas, run by a guy named Joe Civillo. But Joe Civillo ended up going to jail at a big raid of a mafia meeting in upstate New York in the 1950s. And so after that raid happened, all the local mafia kind of fell apart, and it was kind of handed back over to mainly the Chicago outfit. And that's where you get the connection to Jack Ruby. So Jack Ruby is down in Dallas post 1947, I believe, 48, something like that. There's all kinds of rumors about why he ended up leaving Chicago, but ultimately, none of that really matters. He gets down there. His sister is operating a bar. What was it called? The Colony Club, maybe? But they end up eventually opening the Vegas Club, and then after that, they opened up the Carousel Club. Most people don't realize that Jack Ruby really didn't own much in that. He didn't have much of a stake in any of that stuff. He was always broke. And he was working for his sister, Eva Grant, and a guy named Ralph Paul, who were really the muscle and the money behind all of his operations. And Ralph Paul had moved there from Chicago before Jack Ruby. And so it's all outfit connected. But what you'll learn about Ruby through other mobsters is that everybody knew Jack Ruby.
Yep.
He seemed to have carte blanche wherever he went. He knew all the bosses. He knew Giancana and Traficante and all these guys. And so everywhere he went, he was treated like a celebrity until the assassination happens. And then they sell him to us as just some two-bit nightclub owner, some Jewish two-bit nightclub owner who couldn't have any connections to the mob, because there's no way that they would ever make a Jew a made guy, which is hilarious, because when you come to understand who runs the mob, especially back then, you're talking about Meyer Lansky, and you're talking about Meyer Lansky's crew, who were all Jews, right? Mm-hmm. And so ultimately, the Sicilians lost control of the mafia with the assassinations of Joe Masseria and Sal Maranzano. That led to Meyer Lansky and his Murder, Inc. basically taking over, and then they formed the commission, which basically acted as a front or a local management group, I would call them, because they manage operations in America. What Meyer Lansky, he had bigger fish to fry. He was completely involved in the global mafia game. He might have been the boss of all bosses in the whole world. He was dealing with the Yakuza, and he was dealing with, the Corsican mafia. It was wild what Meyer Lansky was doing. And so really post 1930, was it 31? Jews ran the mob, not Italians. And so that's one of the biggest misnomers that there is.
Yeah, well, they handled a lot of the money. So real quick, because we covered a lot there but just to stay focused real quick so that we don't confuse the people. So we talked about Vietnam, that you're saying that Vietnam, he spent a lot of money. He spent $66 billion back then, which is equivalent to about $65 billion today.
Right.
So he had no intention of ending the war, in your estimate.
Correct.
Okay. Do you think he was going to pull back in any kind of way, or was he going to?
I mean, it's possible. We don't know.
Okay.
But then the pressure on him was too great. He wouldn't have been reelected. They would have made sure that there were enough negatives to him not to where I don't think it was even a consideration. And with the CIA even commenting that his move was meant to put pressure, I don't really see any rational justification for him to have pulled out.
Okay.
He was more concerned about nuclear weapons than conventional weapons, for sure.
Gotcha.
So I think he was just already committed, and I don't think it was a possibility.
Second thing, Executive Order 11, I got to look this up. It had something to do with the U.S. dollar.
And silver certificates or something like that. Honestly, I don't know too much about that, but that is what I have heard about that is that that was much more minor, and people blow it up to be something that it wasn't. It hasn't even been a blip on my radar, to be honest with you.
Okay, so not even close. What are the other reasons people said that they?
So
Oh,
Here's the
he
biggest
betrayed the
reason, and
mob.
ultimately
They claimed that he betrayed the mob. Was that true?
he did betray the mob, and they
Okay.
were pissed. And you have to think everybody involved, they don't have to have a united reason.
Okay.
They can have their own reasons. The Israelis had their reason. The CIA had their reasons. Everybody had their own reason. And one thing you have to really come to understand is that in 1963, everybody was a conservative
Okay.
by today's standards.
Okay.
Everybody. So how would conservatives feel if they felt the president was betraying them to a communist country, right? They wouldn't be too happy about it. And that seemingly was the vast majority of people back then.
So him trying to make peace would be seen as being with Russia was obviously post-Cold War.
Right.
They consider that. Okay.
Right. It was the for some reason, at least at the government level, they wanted to perpetuate the Cold War because it was good for America. They thought in their mind. Isolation of them was the goal. But see, and I don't talk about or usually study or have anything to do with the modern era, but you can see how once the Soviet Union fell apart, like really all of the propaganda that we were saturated with about the Soviet Union and all the negativity towards the Soviet, it seemed to be for naught. It seemed to be for nothing, right? So.
All right. So, okay. So I guess the two things that we're talking about as far as there being myths are ending the Vietnam War. We know they actually spent quite a bit more money to keep it going because he couldn't pull out at that point. They were committed. And then the second thing was this executive order, which isn't even really a thing. It didn't even come up on your radar. And then the mafia, he did betray them, you're saying, because what people allege is he took funding from them to get into office, and then once he got into office, he completely turned his back on them. Is that correct? Or
so not only that, Kennedy stole that election. Kennedy stole that election hands down, and he used the Chicago mob to do it. Joe Kennedy cut a deal with the Chicago mob, Giancana in particular, and they stole 3 ballot boxes, and that tipped Chicago in Kennedy's favor, and that's all it took. And so they felt betrayed because they put him there. Literally, the mob put him in office. He would have lost that election. There's a book written on it called, it has the number of the ballot box on it. So I forget what the book is called, but it's out there and people can buy it and read it and they can see exactly what happened.
Wow.
And so
did he pay them to do that? Like, what was their incentive?
I don't know what the arrangement was. Maybe it was Joe Kennedy offering them that we're not going to come after you. We'll leave you alone, that kind of thing. And then
okay, so that's what
from what I understand, Bobby Kennedy finds out about this and he's beyond pissed. And so that's what turned him on the mob, so he could show that he wasn't on the take. You know what I mean? He was angry that this happened in the first place. And so that's why he went after the mob. So it was kind of like this weird paradoxical set of circumstances that led to the persecution of the mafia under Kennedy in the first place. But yeah, ultimately they felt betrayed because of the circumstances at play.
So basically, he was going to come into office and kind of take the attention off the mafia so they can continue to operate in secrecy. Because, I mean, prior to his RFK going after them, no one really knew. It was a shadowy organization. No one knew what the fuck was going on. So when RFK, so basically, Kenny gets into office. He tells them, we're not going to come after you. And then his brother, Attorney General, does go after them. That's what pissed him off? Well,
here's the thing. It's really Joe Kennedy. It's Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, created this mess. And
he was the one that made the promises to the mob.
Exactly. And he made a lot of promises to a lot of people.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay. So it
so
wasn't
he had a lot of people. John Kennedy got in office, and then I have a feeling Joe Kennedy made all these promises. Then Kennedy gets in office, and then Joe Kennedy is like, well, hey, we got to deal with this. And then John Kennedy was like, I don't think so. Right. He's not going to be kissing people's ass because his father made promises. And that, I think, was where the breakdown happened.
Okay. So JFK's father made the promises to the mob. Hey, we'll protect you guys, blah, blah. Son finds out, RFK, senior, not RFK now, guys, junior.
Right.
He finds out, goes at them because he's the attorney general. Brings them in for depositions. I remember he made them all testify and stuff like that.
Right.
Right. And next thing you know, this Omerta, our thing, it becomes a national thing. And everyone knows about the mafia now. So they obviously were pissed off about that. And you think that, okay, so it is true that he betrayed the mob, or, well, at least his father did. Why did they kill his dad then instead of him?
That's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind is it sends a powerful message.
Yeah, killing a sitting president is
right. I'm sure it was discussed to take out Robert Kennedy, and it's alleged. Here's the thing. Here's the problem with things that are alleged. A lot of times that things that are in the public consciousness are not necessarily true, but it is alleged that Traficante had made the comment that on his deathbed that we killed the wrong son, meaning we should have killed Bobby instead of John Kennedy. But who knows if that was actually said? But that's what's out there. That makes a lot of sense.
Gotcha.
To me, at least. But
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so now we know the mafia obviously has an incentive because he kind of blew the lid on who they were, and I didn't know that Kenny was actually supposed to lose that election. He didn't get enough votes. I didn't know that. And then after that, the next one, obviously, I'm trying to think if there's any other myths before we move on to like what actually went down that day.
Most of the myths I find, besides Oswald did it and everything surrounding him, most of the myths that I find that are promoted through the Kennedy conspiracy world. You know, they talk about mysterious shooters on the Grassy Knoll who are provably not there. They talk about Malcolm Wallace on the 6th floor of the depository. They talk about fingerprints that were left behind. I mean, the number of myths surrounding the conspiracy world I find far outweigh the myths that surround the official story. The official story is just a bunch of lies and propaganda.
Yeah. So let's do this.
Nothing we've been told about the official story is true at all.
Yeah. No, it's all, I mean, yeah, with the whole bullet trajectory, the magic bullet theory, it's all crap bullshit. Now, real quick, and I know you have a whole PowerPoint on this. Can we go over who the shooters actually were? So all you guys in here, please pay attention. We're going to go through who the shooters actually were. And if we can like kind of do it, what I'll do is I don't know if you want to pull up your PowerPoint or I can pull up the ones. I know we mentioned one of them, which is Jack Valenti. When you were
right, we can talk about a couple people, but when we get to the Knoll, I'll pull up my PowerPoint.
Okay, sure.
So we got a couple minutes before we can talk about the background. So it's very important to understand that the execution of the assassination and how it actually went down is directly connected to the setup of Oswald, right? Because I, to this day, am the only Kennedy researcher who does not believe for a split second that Lee Harvey Oswald was even at the book depository on November 22nd. I haven't seen a single shred of evidence that can't be explained away. Everything from how he got there to what he did when he was there to how he fled the depository to where he went. None of it makes any sense, and it all falls apart when you dig into the minutia of each thing. Like, it's alleged that Buell Frazier, who was a co-worker of Oswald, gave him a ride that morning to the book depository. And when he parked in back of the book depository, Oswald got out and he walked into the building and he carried a package under his arm that has gone on to be the rifle that allegedly was used. And that's how he snuck it into the building. That has become history. That has become etched in the history books that happened. But when you dig into that story, Buell Frazier will tell you that Oswald was wearing a gray, more or less flannel wool jacket when he showed up that morning to get a ride to work. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all, because we know that after work, Oswald is alleged to have to go home to get his jacket. And at the same time, he picked up his revolver and then he went and murdered J.D. Tippit, the cop, right? So it doesn't make any sense. The things that Buell Frazier said don't make any sense in regards to the person he gave a ride to that day, if he gave a ride to anybody at all. Then you have the activities within the building. And well, if you can replace Oswald with somebody else and not have Oswald walking around, but say it's Oswald, the people he's working with don't know any different, right? And so this is where it begins to lose people, to think that the CIA does not use body doubles and things like that in order to create and to fabricate circumstances. And you have to realize the book depository itself is a den of espionage. It is a CIA front, basically. Do you think that in America, the CIA, who controls the narrative, is going to allow textbooks to be printed that would tell anything other than the story the CIA wants to tell you about our history? Absolutely not. The entire textbook industry in America is clearly run by the CIA because nothing else makes logical sense. And when you look at the other businesses inside the building, the Southeastern Publishing Company, the Macmillan Company, Scott Forsman, all of these companies, you can find when you study these companies, they are CIA contractors, every last one of them. Now, does that mean everybody working for them is a spy? No, obviously not. But people like William Shelley, who was Oswald's alleged boss in the building, along with other guys like O.V. Campbell, who was one of the owners. And to me, the primary conspirator within the book depository was the owner himself, a guy named Jack Kaysen, who is never mentioned virtually anywhere. He's mentioned on one document in all of the Kennedy literature, but that was the guy who owned the building. When you dig into him, he was an extreme right-winger, and he was the head of the local American Legion, which actually in the 60s did stuff back then. They were another group just like the John Birch Society. So he puts himself at the book depository until 12:10 p.m., but that's never really brought into the investigation at any point, because witnesses outside the book depository start to see people on the 6th floor with rifles about 12:10 p.m., right? So the totality of circumstances and the lack of information on Jack Kaysen tells me he's the guy who let him in the back door. At the very same time, they're starting to funnel people out the front door so they can watch the parade. They cleared the building mostly. And my biggest gripe with people who believe that Oswald worked at the book depository just because the government said he did is that if you're going to go to the effort to bring assassins into a building and then make sure that you have the elevator stopped for them and the power killed so they can make sure to get out, if you're going to go to all this trouble, are you just going to let Oswald, who knows nothing about any of this, wander around the building of his own free will? If you know anything about Oswald, he would not have stood outside to watch the president for a split second. He would have given some communist excuse. Oh, I'm not going to go watch that, that American whatever. And he would do this type of thing. So the notion that he would even be anywhere near it is ridiculous. And the idea you're going to let your patsy wander throughout the building and potentially stumble upon your assassins in the area he's alleged to have just been working in, which he would have returned to, doesn't make any sense either. So when you really dig into the details of the book depository, it leads you to the men who established what is called a legend, a false history, a false background. The vast majority of incidents involving Lee Harvey Oswald never involved Lee Harvey Oswald. Some of the famous ones were his shooting at other people's targets at the gun range. That you can clearly trace to somebody other than Oswald. The rifle that was worked on at the gun range was clearly a Argentine Mauser 7.65, not the Carcano that Oswald allegedly used. So when you start to dig into each and every incident of Lee Harvey Oswald and what he did and all the times he started to profess communism, you'll find that he wasn't responsible, and it either wasn't him, and all the incidents of him where we have him on film professing communism, those were obviously all planned and staged events. Even things like his trip to Mexico City. He allegedly took a trip to Mexico City in an attempt to get into Cuba. When you dig into that story, it becomes obvious that he was being framed. He was being set up. And when you come to understand the general cast of characters, and then you dissect each and every incident involving Oswald, you'll come to find that there were basically other people with him at all these incidents, and you can basically easily trace them back to our original cast of characters that we assemble in New Orleans and the mercenaries that came up from Miami. The mercenaries in particular who came up from Miami who were spending time in New Orleans were guys like Lawrence Howard, who is a very heavy-set Mexican with numerous moles all over his face.
Now we're getting into the shooters, so pay attention, guys. Now we're going to get into the shooters. He was setting it up. Basically, long story short for y'all, Oswald wasn't at the book depository, and the person that was Oswald that was captured was someone else, okay? And then, obviously, Oswald was lured to the movie theater later on. But there's basically the person that looks like Oswald that shot the president wasn't Oswald. And they've been setting this up since the 1940s where they're going to have someone that looks just like Oswald, which Cory's going to go into more detail with. But continue on. You're identifying the shooters now. So
sure. So
Jack Valenti first.
When it gets to the actual shooters in the building, you'll find that these people are not random shooters who just show up out of nowhere who are not involved in the setup of Oswald. They're all intimately connected with each other. They're intimately connected with our people down in New Orleans, particularly David Ferrie and Clay Shaw. And inside the book depository, I believe the guy working there was a guy named William Seymour. William Seymour, I can link to at least a dozen impersonations of Oswald at the shooting range, at a car dealership, all kinds of places. At Sylvia Odio's. The Sylvia Odio story is a very important story in the world of Kennedy because allegedly Oswald and two Cubans show up at this Cuban exile's home try to get involved with raising money for the Cuban cause, it's identified as Oswald. But it's clearly not Oswald, because Oswald is still in New Orleans when that happened. And at the exact same time that this stuff is going on, we have another person in Mexico City who is pretending to be Oswald, claiming they're Oswald, calling the Soviet embassy, trying to get a visa, making a scene. So the people who are setting Oswald up, they did it all over the place, and they did it in a manner so you would remember him. They always talked about communism or whatever, all the things that they were told to say, so they would leave an impression in a person's mind, so that after the assassination, when it goes down, they'll remember that person who looked like Oswald, who talked about communism and said he had a Russian wife and all this stuff, right? All these people were given information, and they knew exactly how to set Oswald up. And the man who I believe was working in the book depository that day, who was not a shooter, he was a spotter for sure, is a guy named William Seymour. Oswald is allegedly seen in the book depository.
Can we show a picture of William Seymour so they can see like how they look alike? If you have one.
Yeah, give me just 1 second. It's gonna take me a minute to pull that up.
Yeah, because guys, it's very important that you guys realize that this body double. Because some of y'all might be like, "What the hell? What are you talking about, Myron? You're telling me that there was a body double? This doesn't sound right."
Well, let me explain that in more rational terms. So they were leaving impressions that months later people would then recall, right? That's basically the methodology. And even in CIA training manuals, when it talks about this stuff, it talks about the people don't have to look exactly alike, because when they're not together and scrutinized, the impression that they leave is good enough for the person to be mistaken for the person they want you to think it is.
Gotcha.
And Lee Harvey Oswald all over the news, right? And so every single person who talked about communism who looked like Oswald, they're like, oh, it's that guy. And so they called. Like, the FBI has so many reports of people reporting their interactions with Oswald that some probably are and some probably aren't. But the person that we know as Oswald, he most certainly did not go around professing communism, unless it was to the people who we know were connected to him, which we can say were CIA, like George de Mohrenschildt or Ruth Paine or Michael Paine or some of their friends. So yeah, the person we know as Oswald didn't go around professing communism. The only thing, if we didn't see it on film, like him being on the street corner handing out those flyers, I'm convinced it didn't happen at all. And it's all part of what is known as a legend. A legend is a false history that's created for a spy. And that's exactly what everything was that led up to the assassination. And later, as we'll see, these impersonations of, or the duplicate Oswald theory stretches all the way back. Really, the first evidence for it is in 1947, which obviously doesn't have anything to do with the assassination itself, but had to do with a program to get a spy into the Soviet Union. But let me go ahead and share a screen, and I will go ahead and show you what William Seymour looked like. So the two men who impersonated Oswald were Kerry Thornley, mostly in New Orleans, at a couple places in Dallas in the days leading up to the assassination. But William Seymour was a major player in this. Remember, he didn't have to be identical. All he had to do was be close enough to when not scrutinized could pass. And that's exactly how this operation worked. The thing that gave Seymour away is he was actually a couple inches shorter than Oswald. Oswald that you're seeing now is 5'9" exactly. William Seymour was closer to like 5'7". So in a lot of the descriptions, that became very obvious that it was him, as opposed to Kerry Thornley, who was about 5'10", right? Who's taller than Oswald. So, like I said, they didn't have to be perfect. They just had to be close enough to when not scrutinized could pass. And that's
Cory,
how these things worked.
Question for you. We know why the mafia wanted Kennedy dead. We know why, maybe when we'll switch to Rumble when we'll talk about the Israeli connection. But why did the CIA want Kennedy gone? Because these guys are obviously CIA operatives, Thornley and Seymour. So why did they want Kennedy dead?
Well, those guys in particular just follow orders.
Yeah,
that's what you do
yeah.
At that level. At the higher level, really, I think that they kind of felt betrayed for numerous reasons. I think the Bay of Pigs showed a side of Kennedy, like, because they were trying to, the Bay of Pigs was crucial because they kind of tricked Kennedy, right? They didn't really tell him everything, and they thought that they could count on him, and they couldn't at the end of the day, and he ends up pulling the operation like midway ultimately, and that pissed a lot of people off. But honestly, the more I study the Bay of Pigs, it's ridiculous that it could ever have succeeded in the first place, knowing what I know about it. And so I kind of feel like Allen Dulles played a major role in the Bay of Pigs, and that it was launched intentionally to fail, to expose Kennedy, to give them a reason to try to oust him, right? I think it was part of a larger plot to oust Kennedy from the White House. And why would they want to oust him from the White House? Because he was soft on communism and all the stereotypical stuff that you would think the right-wingers would think. He hadn't done anything to betray America at that point. Who knows what was in their heads and what they understood at that time. Perhaps they just they didn't like the path that they saw him putting forth for America, and saw it eventually leading to a world that is communistic in nature and totalitarian. But it's ironic because Allen Dulles was a diehard, he was a fascist, ultimately. I mean, he definitely supported the fascists in Italy, and he was all about Israel. And he, in particular, wanted to see America, as David Ferrie would put it, turned into one big barbed wire prison, right? So I guess it was just a matter of who was going to be in charge of this prison. That ultimately what it came down to.
And chat, for you guys wondering, Allen Dulles was the first CIA director, for the CIA, and he obviously the Washington D.C. airport is named after him. Did a bunch of bullshit back in the day, a lot of illegal operations. And then the other thing I was going to say as well with Dulles, I also heard that Kennedy was hell bent on disbanding the CIA. Is that true as well, or no?
That's definitely true.
That is true,
because he always felt betrayed. They always lied to him, and he's the president. And who the hell are these people to lie? But he didn't realize that they didn't work for America. They worked for an elite banking international class, you know, and who's the elite banking class, right? Yeah, we all know that's who they work for, and that's who they've always worked for. The CIA was designed with that in mind.
Yeah, it was an old boys club. It was created by a bunch of lawyers and bureaucrats and guys that had some money, and obviously they did a lot of destabilization all around the world to enrich themselves, whether it was what they did in South America with destabilizing the banana industry over there.
Right.
So
United Fruit,
Yeah, United Fruit, exactly, which was a big CIA front. Okay, so we're talking about why they wanted him gone, and then you were showing us Seymour and.
So I showed you William Seymour. My opinion is William Seymour was impersonating Oswald at the book depository, and not everybody had to be in on it, but a couple people were. William Shelley for sure. I've got William Shelley killing the power to the building, which once I get to the Grassy Knoll shooter, we'll pop some slides up here and I'll demonstrate everything that happened. But other than Lawrence Howard was a shooter in the book depository from the sniper's nest, and he is the heavy-set Latino with a pockmarked face.
Can we show a picture of him? And I think it's also important for the audience to realize when Oswald allegedly shot J.D. Tippit, the police officer, the Dallas police officer, there was a witness there. It was a black woman, actually. There was an older black woman.
Right.
And she identified, 2 or 3 individuals, if I'm not mistaken, right? That
that's Akilah Clemens. And Akilah Clemens gave testimony, which definitely indicates there were 2 men involved in the Tippit shooting.
Yes.
All right. And so you have her, and you have Frank Wright, and you have a woman named Doris Holan. And when you combine their testimonies, you get a great description. And then when you extend the realm from which you get descriptors and you bring it back to the Grassy Knoll, you'll find you have another guy named Ed Hoffman. And then you'll have a woman named Velma who's in a car behind the Texas School Book Depository. And when you look at the testimony and the statements that these 5 people in general gave, they're all describing the same man, a man who's probably 5'9", 5'10". He's a heavy man, but he's not very big. And he had a blue suit on and a black hat with a wide felt band. And he left the book depository in a gray 1950s Plymouth, a 1-seater Plymouth car. And then that Plymouth, the gray Plymouth, it appears at the Tippit shooting, right? And so you have logical paths of progression from witness statements that when you combine them all and look at them in their totality, and that's a thing that I find a lot of researchers have trouble with, is looking at things in their totality, taking a step back and seeing the bigger picture. So many people get lost in the minutia that they don't realize half the minutia is wrong in the first place, and it's generated in the heat of the moment. But ultimately, the shooters in the book depository are all connected to David Ferrie, and they're all connected to David Ferrie directly, basically, So the guy on the left here is Lawrence Howard. He's got moles all over his face. He's often described as having a pockmarked face, and he is seen with, well, allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald all over the South, in New Orleans and in Dallas and other places, possibly even Miami. But anytime you see an Oswald sighting with a large husky Latino with a pockmarked face, it's clearly Lawrence Howard and William Seymour. Virtually every time. There might be some exceptions, because when you go through the statements of Kerry Thornley, when he talked to Jim Garrison, and Jim Garrison's the only person who ever brought a trial in the case of the assassination of John Kennedy down in New Orleans. It's a fascinating case, because the government's telling you that Lee Harvey Oswald did it, and yet Garrison is digging up all this information on all the stuff that the government didn't want anybody to know about, right?
And for those that are wondering, Harrison, guys, he was the main character in the famous movie JFK.
Right, Jim Garrison, yeah.
And the only thing that movie got right, to be honest with y'all, was it identified David Ferrie as one of the shooters, or being involved in the conspiracy, at least,
right?
Which I have his picture here for the chat, just so they know. This is the guy that was famously played by, I think it was Joe Pesci, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is David Ferrie right here, guys. So David Ferrie was also one of the shooters, which I'm going to let Cory, when he gets to that part, he'll explain a little bit more about David Ferrie. But these are the other three that a lot of people don't know about, which we're showing you right now with Howard, Seymour, and Hall.
So David Ferrie, he was one of two shooters on the Grassy Knoll. Now, this, you have to, when I came to this conclusion, it was because none of the behavior allegedly involving David Ferrie in the days after the assassination made any sense. And so when you start to dig into the incidents surrounding David Ferrie, you'll find after the assassination, he ends up in Hammond, Louisiana, with a guy named Thomas Compton. And Thomas Compton has a roommate named Frank Chilona. And this is where everything just blew up for me, because Frank Chilona is not in on any scheme. He's just a roommate of a guy who had agreed to give David Ferrie a place to crash after the assassination. So you dig into the statements of Frank Chilona, you realize David Ferrie was in Hammond, Louisiana the entire weekend after the assassination, at a time when he's supposed to be in Houston, allegedly bringing a couple guys to an ice skating rink where they're going to go ice skating. And so the whole ice skating story at a place called the Winterland Ice Skating Rink ends up falling apart. And then when you're like, well, damn, why did he come up with a story about being in Houston? It's like, well, duh, he was in Dallas. That's why he had to come up with this big, long alibi that doesn't make any sense. And so eventually I put him on the Grassy Knoll, thanks to the 5 witnesses that I just mentioned. Well, 2 of them, Ed Hoffman, who sees a man in the blue suit with a dark colored hat with a wide felt band. He sees him fire a shot from the corner of the picket fence, coincides with the first shot that hit Kennedy in the throat. David Ferrie then takes that rifle and he will throw it to his backup guy, who's dressed in a railroad worker's uniform, guy who I have identified by the name of Andrew Jerome Blackman. He's all over the literature. He's he's in the Merchant Marine. I was actually able to locate the ship he came in on, when he departed, all that stuff. He was definitely there, pulled into Galveston Harbor that weekend. And actually, Jack Ruby drove him back to his boat over the weekend after the assassination, when Jack Ruby is not even supposed to be anywhere near there. He's supposed to be in Dallas all weekend, but even Jack Ruby has a body double, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. So back to the shooters. David Ferrie, first shooter on the Grassy Knoll. And now we can move on to Jack Valenti.
I showed them a picture of Ferrie. I had it up while you had the other ones up. But yeah, so now, okay. So we got, oh my God, pop face, the Hispanic pop face guy. Lawrence Howard, Seymour, and Hall. Did we talk about Hall?
Loran Hall. Yeah, so Loran Hall, he's busted. Well, number one, this is a trio of people traveling across the country for a couple of years before the assassination, doing mercenary stuff.
Can we pull the picture up one more time? Those 3? Just so the chat knows. There we go. So these are 3 guys. Okay, go ahead. Keep going.
Right. Sorry. So I was actually contacted recently by somebody who knows Loran Hall's stepson, who's still alive.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, and they haven't returned an email of mine, but hopefully I'll get to talk to him one day. William Seymour is still alive, just so you know.
Okay.
I have his phone number. I just don't have the balls to call him. I'm going to straight up say it. It's not my thing to go reaching out and interviewing people. And so, but no, William Seymour is alive. He's living, I think it's in Tucson. He's about 86 years old. So his clock's ticking too. But yeah, these are the 3 guys who traveled across the country together, back and forth between Los Angeles and Miami. There's a lot of sightings of Oswald the summer of '63 down in Miami, which don't make any sense to me. I believe they were William Seymour impersonating him down there. And William Seymour actually and Loran Hall will get arrested in Dallas in October about a month before the assassination. They're arrested with a truck full of weapons. They didn't go to jail for the weapons. They went into jail because they got busted with a bottle of speed pills. And so, but that entire case ended up being, they were booked, photographed, and everything. It ended up getting deleted from the Dallas police records. There's no record of it anywhere. There's just the testimony of them who said they were arrested. Oh. So that's kind of crazy too. But yeah, that's Loran Hall on the right. Loran Hall is really actually, besides his associations with these guys, he's busted because he had a rifle that he had picked up from a guy in Los Angeles, a guy named Richard Hathcock, who ran a little private detective agency. And he was holding on to this rifle, which was a Johnson 30-06 rifle. And for some reason, we don't know why, they didn't say they found it, but it's obvious that they did. The FBI, within 24 hours of the assassination, had the rifle, the entire backstory to the rifle, had sent FBI agents who had already talked to Richard Hathcock, and he said straight up that Loran Hall picked up the rifle and told him he was on his way to Dallas. So, doesn't really take much rocket science to figure that one out. Hall was most certainly a shooter on the 6th floor opposite of Lawrence Howard. And so that rifle got left somewhere. The rumor is it was found by the lawn crew the next day and turned in, but that doesn't leave enough time to get your people in place, you know, to have the person who had the rifle interviewed within 24 hours. My suspicion is that it was left in the book depository and they found it, because when you look at how many rifles got found in Dealey Plaza that day, we're talking like five rifles at least that are known to have been found, that they deny were found, 3 Mausers, the Carcano, and the Johnson, and possibly one more, which would be seen in Willis photo number 10, because there's another man arrested in Dealey Plaza, which offsets the entire timeline of the assassination, but he's arrested wearing all black and they took a rifle off of him. And the only way we know about that is because of the Willis 10 photo, plus a few random statements from witnesses.
Okay.
But that brings us to the Grassy Knoll, if you want to get onto that.
Yeah, no, we definitely will. And these individuals, just so the chat knows, were all, I guess, contractors for the CIA, these 3.
Right, but the CIA is slick, right? So what they do is they have what's called plausible deniability. Mm-hmm. And so from what I can tell, this was organized down in, mostly in New Orleans. I mean, the connection between all these guys definitely kind of converges with Clay Shaw and David Ferrie, but they, of course, had people above them. There's inklings of a guy named Roswell Thompson, who was a partner of Carlos Marcello. Because remember, the mob is working with the CIA constantly for the drug importation. Mm-hmm. And so you have the CIA working with Marcello. So, I mean, there's record of a meeting with some of Marcello's associates and one of Marcello's brothers, with Roswell Thompson and David Ferrie and Clay Shaw and a couple other people, a guy named Thomas Beckham. And so you definitely have oversight going on, but ultimately, I found that they really left a lot to people like Kerry Thornley, because when I started to discover things that Kerry Thornley had done, like the flyers for the Fair Play for Cuba committee. So let me just preface, Kerry Thornley was in the Marines with Oswald for a brief time. All right. That's where he knows Oswald, but I'm pretty confident because of my recent research that Kerry Thornley was paired with Oswald way back when these guys were all still in the Marines, and it had nothing to do with Kennedy. It had to do with getting the spy into the Soviet Union. But Kerry Thornley, he tells the Warren Commission and the FBI and everybody in the world that he was in the Marine Reserves from 56 to 58, didn't really do anything. He was in high school at the time. And then he gets in the Marine Reserves, or gets into the actual Marines, and he just goes to basic boot camp, and then he meets Oswald, and he just kind of downplays his entire experience in the Marines. Well, just this past week, I was able to acquire his military records. And
oh, shit. For Thornley?
Jesus. What's that? For Kerry Thornley, yeah.
For Kerry Thornley, okay.
And so Kerry Thornley actually got into the actual Marines in 56, not the reserves, and he had nothing but training for 2 years. Then, once Oswald is sent, he goes to Atsugi, and then he comes back to America. Once he comes back to America, they send Kerry Thornley to Atsugi. And once Kerry Thornley is in Atsugi, he starts to investigate Oswald and Oswald's crew. We know this because of the statement written by a guy named Ronald Schwinghammer. And Ronald Schwinghammer basically says that he was approached by a guy named Rick Thornley. So you have Kerry Thornley in Atsugi in the Marines using an alias. and that he was taking pictures of where Oswald had worked, and he was asking all these questions about Oswald. Doesn't make any sense. He will provide a cover that he was writing a book about Oswald, and he did. He ends up writing a book which was finished in 1962 called The Idle Warriors, which is a book about Oswald and the defection to the Soviet Union. It was really more about what do Marines do in downtime, right? When you're trained to kill, but you're just sitting around doing nothing. That was what he said the book was about. But really, he ended up shaping it around Oswald, which is kind of ironic because as you get closer to the assassination and both of these guys are out of the Marines, they connect in New Orleans. And then the setup of Oswald begins, and Kerry Thornley was the driving factor behind the setup of Oswald down there. I'm completely convinced of that. And he had a lot of freedom. The aliases, Heidel, Osborne, there's another couple actually of the aliases that Oswald allegedly used that were all Marine buddies. But since Oswald wasn't setting himself up, Kerry Thornley was the only other person who was actually in Oswald's group who knew the exact same people Oswald did. So all the aliases you can trace right back to Kerry Thornley, right? But nobody ever talks about this when they talk about the Kennedy assassination. And so Kerry Thornley will eventually be the Oswald lookalike who shoots J.D. Tippit. And this becomes obvious when you, and I keep harping on this, it's about the relationships at play here. You got to understand who is spending their time with who is working with who, right? And once you understand the cast of characters down in New Orleans, the people in Dealey Plaza, particularly in the book Depository and at the Daltex, all falls into place, right? The outside forces that were involved, besides New Orleans, you have the other mob bosses appeared to have to have sent somebody. I think it's kind of one of their things. You know, if we're going to send somebody, you got to send somebody. So they ended up sending people from the Cleveland mob, the tramps, the three tramps that are arrested. Those are guys from the Cleveland mob. Danny Green, the tall tramp. Danny Green, the head of the Longshoremen Union at the time, but he was a mobster. He got put there by the mob. So you've got that. You've got the Chicago outfit sends Dave Yaris. They send Lenny Patrick. They send Robert Bernard Baker. Robert Bernard Baker, if you're familiar with Kennedy at all, there's a fat guy who is on top of the overpass at the time of the shooting. You can see him from a distance in the photographs. That's Robert Bernard Baker, 350-pound guy, worked for Jimmy Hoffa, really as an extension of the Chicago outfit. He's up on the overpass, and I've got Dave Yaris as one of the shooters who misses, and the shot ends up in the grass, in the grassy area across from the Grassy Knoll, and then it's later dug out of there by somebody, and the bullet mysteriously disappears. That's all captured in photographs. So the last but not least, you have Jack Valenti on the Grassy Knoll, who Jack Valenti, like I said, born into two mob families. He ends up going off into the war, but he's a bomber pilot allegedly, but I can't really track his movements after he gets out of bombing school. There's no way he spent that much time, in bombing missions. He allegedly flew 50 bombing missions, but if you're going to be an assassin this good, who's talked about by Otto Skorzeny identified the Knoll shooter as having used the aliases of Max and Zed. And so then I find documents in the ZR rifle files where Max actually is referred to Frank Sturgis by Santos Trafficante, which totally fit my separate research that Valenti was loyal to the Trafficantes because of the familial connection to Tampa, which is kind of how the mob works, right? So everything started to fall into place around Valenti for me. There's a couple aliases, Rosani and Rosanoff. That, damn it, if I could identify Rosani and Rosanoff as Jack Valenti and Jean-Pierre Lafitte, that will be the icing on the cake of everything. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll ever be able to do that. But Jack Valenti, nonetheless, he goes on to run the Motion Picture Association of America. He was the guy behind the movie rating system.
Yep.
The movie ratings, actually, when you really dig into it, it was a form of censorship. Yep. Jack Valenti also sat on the board of the Recording Industry Association of America, the RIAA, which was music, right? He sat on that with a guy named Charles Bronfman. So what does that mean? It means Jack Valenti was the head of the censorship industrial complex before we had what we consider today. They talk about the censorship industrial complex, right? He was on the movie boards. He was on music boards. It was his job to censor Americans. And that's what he did. And that's what the movie rating system ultimately was. Mm-hmm. And so the life that he lived after the assassination, you can tell he did his job. He did it well, and he was rewarded more than anyone else. Because David Ferrie was up there on the knoll also, and they threw that guy to the wolves afterwards. You'd think that he'd have some money or anything. No. David Ferrie ended up blackmailing Carlos Marcello for about 50 grand. And Carlos Marcello gave it to him. And he opened a gas station with it that folded within 9 months.
Question for you.
David,
with Valenti, because you can see him here. I got a picture up for the chat to see. You can literally see Jack Valenti as Lyndon B. Johnson's being sworn in, with obviously Jackie Kennedy next to him with the blood still on her dress.
Yeah.
So the guy that killed her husband, that shot if I'm not mistaken, he shot the headshot, is right there in
Yes.
Air Force One with the widow.
Yes.
Incredible.
So let me explain. Actually, I'll explain as I go through the slides because I got them all queued up, ready to go.
Okay. So yeah, and Jack Valenti was a CIA asset as well, right? And he was an aide to Lyndon B. Johnson. And did Lyndon B. Johnson know that?
I don't think so. People say he did, but here's the deal. Are you going to want your next president, the guy who's in line, are you going to want him to know any details at all?
Yeah.
I don't think so, because if he knows anything, he can talk eventually.
True. Yeah.
And I honestly think to the day he died, he never really knew the full details. And honestly, even though Jack Valenti would be his right-hand man for the next 3 years in the White House, I don't know that he ever knew that Valenti was the shooter. Or if he did, I think maybe that was their way of keeping him in line.
Yeah, because I'm literally
hey, you know what I did
right
to
now,
Kennedy? I could do that to you too.
This photograph right here with Jack Valenti in the back, he's the only person that looks extremely stressed as Lyndon B. Johnson is being, sworn in. And, you can see that it looks like he's sweating a bit, which would make sense. Obviously, it wasn't like it was a warm day in Dallas that day. And, shooting someone in a full-on suit from the Grassy Knoll, I guess, and then running to Air Force One. But, okay. Sorry, so you had something you wanted to show your PowerPoint, right?
Yeah, well, I'll go ahead and I'll show how the Grassy Knoll stuff went down.
Yeah.
And then I'll show a couple slides on what happened in the book depository. And from there, we'll hop over to Oswald.
Okay.
All right. You can see this, right?
Yep, I can see it.
All right. So this is Altgen's photo number 7. Altgen's photo number 7 is extremely important. First off, shots have already been fired, but everyone's calm. And how do we know shots have already been fired? Because you have 2 people here who are already panicking. The guy all the way on the right-hand side, the guy in the construction hat, he is already panicking. When you read this, I forget what his name is offhand, but when you read his statements to the FBI.
Can you point him out real quick for us?
Yeah, he's right here.
Okay. Gotcha.
See my cursor? All right.
Yeah.
That guy's he's ready. He's jumping. He's ready to go. And he even said that when the FBI interviewed him. He was a construction worker on break. And as soon as he heard shots, he started to jump and move and get out of there. And look at everyone else, even the Secret Service. They're all calm. There's another woman between number 3 and 4. She's diving onto the ground. You can see her in some of the other photographs. She knows what's going on. She heard shots and she didn't expect that. So she's getting down. Everyone else is just standing there calm, right? The Secret Service had looked around like, what was that? And you can't see it in this photo. That's in Altgen's photo number, I think it's in Altgen's photo number 3. But everyone's calm, and that always freaked me out, how they could be so calm when shots are already being fired and 2 people are already panicking. But this shot here, we have 8 people that you can see and 2 people who are out of sight, Samuel Keeney and Emory Roberts. They're in the front seats. But you have 10 people on this car, but 2 of them are going to get off. You have Clint Hill, who gets out, and Dave Powers, who gets out of the car. So you'll only have 8. This is the Secret Service follow-up car. Everyone else stays in the car, and the official story is that 8 people rode to Parkland. This is Clint Hill. He got out of the car and jumped onto the back of the president's limousine, ran to them from the Secret Service car. I'm going to skip some of these statements because they're not overly important at the moment. So then you have right here, this is McIntyre photo number 1. And what you see here, I'll zoom in on it. You only have 1 person on the side of the Secret Service car right now, and it's neither of the Secret Service agents. Both Secret Service agents on the side of the car have already entered the car. And we know this because this person here has a flat top. And when you come to this next photo, you can clearly see it's a flat top. It's not either of the people who were on the side of the car before. So now when you get to this photo here, when you count the people in the car, there's now 10 people on the car when there should only be 8. They added 2 people. So the original Secret Service men were John D. Jack Reedy and Paul E. Landis. They're both white guys. They're both about 6 foot tall. And you can see how high they are, how tall they are in comparison to the frame of the vehicle. This is extremely important because when we see the shooter and his handler on the side of the Secret Service car, which is coming up in the next frame, that you'll see that they're short. See, tall guys, tall white guys in this photo here. So the 2 people that they picked up were Jack Valenti and David Morales. Jack Valenti being the shooter on the Grassy Knoll who came over the top of the overpass and was picked up on the other side. David Morales was in Dealey Plaza. And when you had a lot of witnesses who said that the president's limousine stopped or slowed, a lot of people try to say that it stopped or slowed to allow the shooter to shoot him.
Can we zoom in on those two real quick? Can we zoom in on Jack Valenti and David Morales, who are now on the vehicle?
Yes.
If we could zoom in on them. Oh, boom. Okay.
There you go. So Jack Valenti is only 5'4". Look how short he is compared to, and David Morales is only 5'9" compared to the two guys who were on the car who were 6 foot tall.
Gotcha.
Plus, David Morales is Hispanic and black. He's darker skinned. He's a light skin, but he's darker skinned than anybody else. And you can kind of see that. And you can see he's got a mustache here, right? He's wearing glasses and he got a flat top. And so he stepped on in Dealey Plaza when the two Secret Service agents got into the middle row. And that's the kicker, because one of them, John Reedy, he says that he got in the front row, right? John D. Jack Reedy claims to have gotten into the Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza, but he said he got into the front seat, the front row of seats right next to Emory Roberts. Obviously, he lied because he's not there. He's in the middle row. And being in the middle row, there should only be one person there. And that should be Kenny O'Donnell. And Kenny O'Donnell is surrounded by two other guys. Kenny O'Donnell is number 7 here. Number 6, you can see number 6's head right there. I mean, just clearly 3 people in that second row. And that's the key to the entire assassination right there. The two Secret Service agents, and one of them still alive. You've got Paul Landis, who's going around saying that he planted the magic bullet and that all this stuff when he was a willing participant in this assassination. In 61 years, he's never mentioned that they stopped and picked up a passenger in Dealey Plaza and then one on the other side of the overpass. He's never mentioned that in all these time. Now let's get to the magic bullet. I don't think I have any slides on it, but I'll tell the story. So these guys from here head to Parkland Hospital. Jack Valenti allegedly didn't go to Parkland. He allegedly went to the Trade Mart, where he deals with Evelyn Lincoln and Pamela Tonur and a whole bunch of the Kennedy secretaries. But in my book, as it explains, all that's a lie. None of the people who were there who he says he was with provide an alibi for him at any time. And so he ends up at Parkland Hospital, where he puts himself in the basement. And what happened in the basement? That's where they found the magic bullet. So basically, he was the shooter. He used if I'm not mistaken, he also used an Enfield 303, because later on, they will attempt to pull Buell Frazier into this. He will be arrested that day, and allegedly they take off of him an Enfield 303 and boxes of 303 ammunition. Now, this makes perfect sense when you realize that they were trying to set Buell Frazier up at the shooting range, where they dropped the name Buell Frazier as having given Oswald a ride there. Oswald, who was William Seymour, who was working at the book depository, that's how he knew Buell Frazier. He tells the guy at the shooting range that he was brought there by a guy named Frazier, right? And this is told to the FBI. So they're laying a false trail to Buell Frazier this whole time, right? And so when they get to the Parkland Hospital, the rifle that he used, he held on to, right, from the knoll to this vehicle here, which is probably in the back seat somewhere. Then he gets out, he plants the magic bullet, and then the rifle is probably at Parkland handed off to Bill Decker or one of his guys, because that rifle shortly after this will end up at Buell Frazier's house when they arrest him. So how do I know it's the same rifle? Because of course it's the same rifle, right? These guys were meticulous. And why plant the magic bullet, which originally was a 303 round, right? So the magic bullet we see today is a Mannlicher Carcano round. It's in perfect condition. It's pristine. That thing didn't hit anything. It was shot into cotton wadding or water. The two guys who were at the Parkland Hospital, Darrell Tomlinson and O.P. Wright, both of those guys told the FBI and the Secret Service when they showed up, told them that it was a pointed tip bullet. And the Carcano is not a pointed tip bullet. And O.P. Wright specifically said it was a 303 round. That bullet went from them to Richard Johnson, the Secret Service agent. It then went to the FBI. And once it got to the FBI, you would think the Secret Service would be the ones to obfuscate it, but no, the FBI did. And why did the FBI obfuscate it? Well, that, to me, goes back to Oswald and Oswald's life and the FBI's role in handling Oswald as he's growing up. I think that's the primary driving factor behind the FBI's involvement, was not so much the assassination and cover-up, but covering up what I discussed. I had this conversation earlier, 50 years of covert activity by not only the CIA, who only goes back to 20 years at this point, but everyone seems to forget about naval intelligence, which has been doing covert ops since like the 1800s, right? So I believe naval intelligence played a big role in the nurturing of Oswald, which ultimately led to this multi-agency cooperative plot to get a spy into the Soviet Union, which then, once it was transformed into the assassination plot and used to kind of tie up loose ends, I think that's when people like Hoover were like, I think when he found out that it was Oswald who was being the patsy in this assassination, I think his jaw probably hit the floor, because he'd been well aware of what Oswald was doing in the Soviet Union. And if you ask me, he probably knew everything Oswald was doing for decades before, right? Since he was born, probably. It seems to me Hoover knew a whole lot more than he ever let on about Oswald, because he lets things slip at times and knows things he shouldn't know. So from here, let me see, this is David Morales and Jack Valenti. Yeah. A handler and a shooter, and that's always how it goes. Every assassination, but whether the CIA or the mafia, from what I can tell, is always a pair, a spotter and a shooter. And I think the same thing applied to Dave Yaris, who had Lenny Patrick with him, and both of those guys, I'll tell that story another time. But I think it's always done like this. And so...
And he was wearing a black suit. Like, I got the picture right here with Lyndon B. Johnson being sworn in. And you can see Jack Valenti is wearing a black suit in this photo as well. Mm-hmm. Another coincidence.
His disheveled nature, I think, is kind of a hint towards it. But if you read my book and you get to the chapter on what Jack Valenti's alibi was, once the alibi falls apart, you realize, damn, he made all this stuff up. He went to great lengths to tell a very dramatic story about what he did. So here we go. I have a picture of William Seymour, and I have the video of this, and you can see much more detail in the video. But that's William Seymour, and the guy in the background is a guy named Ira Trantham. Ira Trantham, the detective in that gray coat, he's not supposed to be there for at least another 10 minutes at all. When you read his statement, he got stuck in traffic and all this stuff, and he doesn't show up for another 10 minutes. After this, you see what happens here is William Seymour is in the video. He gets a signal from Trantham, so they're in on this together. Trantham's clearly in on this because later on, a guy will get arrested named Larry Florer. He'll be arrested allegedly out of the Daltex building, but really it was the county records building. But Larry Florer is really just a cover for Ted Shackley. Ted Shackley basically gets arrested here in Dealey Plaza under the name Larry Florer, but then they do a typical CIA swap, and Ted Shackley is let out the back door, and then Larry Florer actually goes into custody. It's crazy. It's a crazy story. It's more of the body double switching stuff, which after we get through with Oswald won't seem as crazy anymore. But what I'm trying to get to is the book depository in particular. So we'll start with this Richard Randolph Carr, and this is a statement from the trial of Clay Shaw. So he's working in a building adjacent to the book depository, so he can see into like the 5th floor, the 6th floor really close. So when he's up there, he sees a guy over in the book depository, and he basically describes him as having, there's this guy on the right. I'll just get to the point. It's this guy on the right. He describes him as having a tan sport coat and a hat and a white shirt and these pants, and he describes where he walks and all this stuff. And then I find this matching the exact description in the background of a photograph. He says, while I was on Houston Street near Commerce intersection, I saw a man whom I believe was identical with the man I've seen earlier looking out of the window of the Texas School Book Depository building. This man was walking very fast, proceeded on Houston Street south to Commerce, then east on Commerce Street to Record Street, which is 1 block south of Houston. This man got into a 1961 or 62, it's actually a 52, gray Rambler station wagon, which was just parked north of Commerce on Record Street. The station wagon, which had Texas license on it, was driven by a young Negro man and driven off. So Lawrence Howard is often referred to as a Negro in Dealey Plaza, which is really kind of interesting. I guess he was a very dark complected guy at the time. So, all right, we're going to get to the book depository and what happened inside of the book depository. And this is from a woman named Vicki Adams. Vicki Adams worked for the Scott Forsman Company, who was a CIA contractor, and she was on the 4th floor. The assassination happens. She attempts to get down in the elevator, but she can't because the power has been cut to the building and it hasn't been turned back on yet. So her and another woman, they take the stairs down in a hurried manner. And the thing about Vicki Adams is that she's always used so that people could say, well, Oswald couldn't have come down the stairs as he's alleged to, because Vicki Adams was on the stairs and Oswald didn't pass her. So obviously Oswald didn't come down the stairs. That's the official conspiracy theory story surrounding Vicki Adams. But really, that's just to distract you from what really happened with Vicki Adams. So Vicki Adams gets to the bottom of the stairs, and directly in front of her is William Shelley and Billy Lovelady, who are one of the bosses of the book depository and a guy who worked allegedly with Oswald. Well, where she happens to see them at, this is the stairs she comes down, She sees two of them. She files multiple reports about this. None of this makes it into the official story or the official conspiracy theory. Nobody ever talks about this aspect of the assassination for some reason. But she comes down, she sees them, and it's reported to the FBI, the Dallas police. She tells everybody, she testifies to it at the Warren Commission. Bill Shelley, who is one of the bosses of the depository, he never mentions it in his statement that he's inside. He says he's outside, which he was. And as soon as the shooting happened, he runs into Dealey Plaza, but that's not what really happened. Same thing with Billy Lovelady. He said the exact same thing, that he ran into Dealey Plaza and then came back a couple minutes later. He never said anything about going inside of the book depository at any time. So the Warren Commission, she's being asked, the Warren Commission was the commission that was put together after the assassination to do a thorough investigation. But really the purpose of the Warren Commission was to prevent independent investigation, meaning they didn't want anybody outside their little clique doing any type of official investigations. So they basically limited it to the FBI and some of the Dallas police stuff, and that was it. I mean, they didn't let any other federal organizations get involved because they needed to control the evidence. And one thing I need to say is that the Dallas police, when they went out to Oswald's place and Ruth Payne's place, they ended up collecting 230 pieces of evidence, give or take. But secretly on November 23rd, the FBI came and confiscated all of it. Again, in secret on the 26th, they returned the evidence to the Dallas police, but instead of having 230 items, there's well over 450 items. So in those 3 days, the FBI fabricated over 200 pieces of evidence, things that Oswald would never have had in his possession in the first place, things like 10-year-old tax documents that would indicate a certain year that he worked at a place. They've manufactured tax documents, employment cards, you name it. And thanks to John Armstrong, whose work we're going to talk about here coming up. Thanks to John Armstrong, who had a lot of the documents analyzed that the FBI had returned to the Dallas police in this mass dumping of evidence that they fabricated, he found that in regards to a lot of the tax documents, no matter what company, what year, what state, where they were, who ran the place, all the tax documents were typed on the same typewriter. So they gave themselves away in faking the evidence by typing them all on the same typewriter, which really is kind of funny because the OSS got busted doing the same thing in World War II with the Nazis. They fabricated over 300 documents and got busted because the vast majority were done on the same typewriter, just like the FBI did here. But, you know, I guess that's what they had to do. So what we're looking at now is a portion of Warren Commission testimony from Vicki Adams. And she has shown a diagram. The diagram is allegedly Commission's Exhibit 496, but when we look at what 496 actually is, 496 is a copy of Oswald's job application at the book depository. And honestly, now that I'm seeing this, and after having familiarized myself with tons of documents written in Oswald's hand, this doesn't look like Oswald's handwriting now that I'm actually looking at this. It was not nearly as swirly or as, like, he never did this with his O's. None of it. Anytime you see anything, and God, and there was always a pronounced, I'm not even a document examiner, but this is just obvious right on its face. So, but what's really killer here is that the documents 496 is supposed to be a diagram. So they show her a diagram of the first floor, and she points to where she saw Billy Shelley and Billy Lovelady. But obviously, that diagram has since been disappeared and replaced with this document. But this is the area that she saw them in. She saw them directly in front of the electric panel. And a woman named Geneva Hine provided a statement that said it was about 12:29, and she was on the phone when the power went out. And so basically what happened is William Shelley killed the power to the building. He then goes out front. The assassination happens. He and Billy Lovelady, who's obviously in on this with him, run back into the building. He then turns the power back on. And why would they do this? Because they needed the elevator to stay planted on the 6th floor. Look at what happened. Vicki Adams tried to get the elevator and it wouldn't work. Imagine if it did work. The shooters on the 6th floor would be stuck there, right? So the power of the building's cut. They're in the elevator. He goes back in. She goes down the stairs. She sees them. He puts the power back on. Then 3 of them come down in the elevator. Lawrence Howard and Sergei Arkacha, who was on the roof, he's another guy from New Orleans, they head out the back door. They get into a green Rambler station wagon, which was seen by Richard Randolph Carr. This is the Alton's photo, I believe, number 3. That is clearly not Oswald in front. That is Billy Lovelady in front before he ran back in with William Shelley and turned the power back onto the building. Then we get, and this will be the last thing I cover before we hop over to Oswald, Like I said, I have no evidence that Oswald was ever there that day. The ride to work falls apart. His activities inside the building can be explained by the fact that William Seymour was there. And his fleeing the building at exactly 12:33 p.m., that doesn't make any sense either. And when you dig into the statements of these two guys who allegedly are the ones who interacted with him, you'll come to realize that nobody saw him leave, right? So the story of getting there falls apart, the story of being there falls apart, and the story of leaving falls apart. So what does that tell you? He was never there. And to me, it's the most obvious thing in the world that people have a hard time wrapping their head around, because that means that everybody's complicit in this massive conspiracy. And that's pretty damn true, because conspiracies aren't about getting together in a small, smoky room. They're about taking orders. And that's what this was. Multiple organizations with soldiers on the ground taking orders, who probably didn't have a goddamn clue what they were involved in half the time in the build-up to the assassination, right? So Pierce Allman, he basically, the modern version of his story is that he saw Oswald coming down the steps. He obviously didn't know who he was, but it's a young guy. He asks him, where's a phone? And he tells him where there's a phone, and he goes in and and that's the story, right? And so, but that didn't happen. He says that he didn't know Lee Harvey Oswald at the time. He does not remember seeing him in or around the depository, right? So he says he doesn't know Marina or Jack Ruby or any of that stuff. So obviously the story that he tells in the modern era, or before he died, it's total bullshit, right? This is his original statement. He doesn't know nothing. The guy he was with, Terrence Ford, same thing. He said he wasn't acquainted with any of these guys and he doesn't remember seeing any of them. Then you get to Robert McNeil, same thing. In the modern era, it's the same exact story, which is weird enough in and of itself that he would have the exact same story as Pierce Allman when they weren't together. But he does. He tells the same exact story. And that story falls apart when you read this statement and you realize that he didn't interact with Oswald at all. And in fact, the way and the manner in which he interacted with anybody there didn't even match. He interacted with 3 people who were inside the building, not one person who was outside the building. And then his New York news desk places the time of his call, because he went in there to use the phone, at 12:36 p.m. Now, this 12:36 p.m. rewrites the entire timeline of the assassination, because what he says here, if I can find it, he says that no cops entered the building before me or until I left. He says, I do not believe any police officers entered the building before me or until I left. Well, if they had, he would have known it, because the story about the cops entering the building has to do with Baker and Truly, Officer Baker, who's the motorcycle cop who gets off and runs in and allegedly confronts Oswald inside the second floor lunchroom while he's drinking a Coke, right? That's within 90 seconds of the assassination. Well, this story is a complete fabrication. They never did it. They never did run in there 90 seconds afterwards, because Robert McNeil would know, because within 30 seconds of that, all the other cops ran into the building. So obviously the timeline is completely off. And we know this thanks to this timestamp from the New York Times. So what really happened is that Baker, the motorcycle cop who gets off the vehicle and runs towards the book depository door. Well, if you watch the couch film, which is what he's captured in, he doesn't go to the book depository front door. He runs past it to Houston Street. And why? Because he saw that, in my opinion, and based on the evidence, kind of points at this, he saw the shooter at the Daltex who was below the fire escape outside. He was not inside the building. He was on a ledge directly below the fire escape. He runs north on Houston Street, and I think Baker chased after him. Then fast forward a couple minutes, this guy is in custody. He's wearing all black, and they've taken a rifle off of him. And this is captured in the Willis 10 photo. Even Willis says they arrested a guy in that photo. That's what he took a picture of. He'll later backtrack on the story, but his initial statements on it the initial statements are always truer than the backtrack stories later on. So that to me tells me that Baker couldn't have made it in the building 90 seconds after the assassination, that it must have been further. It must have been way after. You have Robert McNeil's timestamp at 12:36. And this makes perfect sense to me, because let me see if I can find it. So those are the 3 guys in the couch film. And here, I believe you can see in the photograph, you can see the hands and the head of the person holding a rifle underneath the fire escape there. I've identified this person as Emilio Santana, who rode to Dallas with Sergio Arcacha after they were seen leaving New Orleans heading to Dallas. I don't want to get into circumstances of that. That'll take forever. So this is the Willis 10 photo. We have a man in black being taken into custody. In the background, you see a rifle there. To me, this happened at around 12:36, 12:37 maybe. And then Baker and Truly will run into the book depository. And so this is a handwritten statement from Officer Baker. All right, and he lies in part of it, and he tells the truth in part of it, and so it's hilarious how he outlines this. He said they followed the man to the rear of the building, and he said, "Let's take the elevator." The elevator was hung several floors up, so we used the stairs instead. We searched on the third or fourth floor. As we reached the third or fourth floor, I saw a man walking away from the stairway. I called to the man, and he turned around and come back towards me. The manager said, "I know that man. He works here." And then the man walked away, right? He turned the man loose on the floor, up to the top floor they went. So what does that mean? This is the exact story of the Oswald in the lunchroom with a Coke story, where Oswald's identified by Roy Truly as an employee, and he says, "I know that man, he works here." That even made it into the JFK movie, right? But that never happened. It's pure myth. It actually happened on the stairwell between the third and fourth floors, and the man was not Oswald. It was William Seymour, because as he will say in a statement coming up, the man was wearing a light brown jacket, right? Oswald wasn't wearing a jacket. He didn't have a jacket. The story is he had to go home to get his jacket, right? So clearly not Oswald, the man they're dealing with. But it was like, but this is the important part. He was identified as an employee by Roy Truly. Roy Truly, okay? We'll talk about Roy Truly later when we get to a guy named Fred Korth, who was the Secretary of the Navy, who basically managed Oswald all throughout his life. But Roy Truly is connected to Oswald in more ways than one, not just through the book depository. So, but here, this is from J.W. Fritz, who was from Dallas Police, Captain Dallas Police. Basically, he backs up the story of Baker stopping the man on the third or fourth floor, not in the lunchroom, right? So we have multiple pieces of documentation that disprove the lunchroom story. This is key here. So the picture I showed you earlier was of William Seymour in the railroad yard, and he's wearing a light brown jacket.
Yep. The look
right
like
here,
the body double
you got right, the Oswald double, right? When we get to the real Oswald doubles later on, it's gonna blow your mind. David Bellin, he's talking to Baker, and he asks him about what the guy was wearing, because Oswald was wearing a dark brown shirt that was buttoned at the bottom, and he had a white T-shirt on underneath. That's the description David Bellin's looking for, okay? So we asked Baker what he looks like, and he says, at the particular time I was looking at his face, it seemed to me he had a light brown jacket on and maybe some kind of white-looking shirt. It's actually like a light blue polo shirt, believe it or not. And it was hanging out to its side. It was kind of dim in there, but it was hanging out to his side. And he's handing him Commission's Exhibit 150, which is, I'm assuming, a picture of the dark brown shirt. He said, "Have you ever seen this before?" And remember, Baker will later see the allegedly real Oswald in the office of the Dallas Police, where he sees him wearing the dark brown shirt, okay? And so he's questioning him about the comparison between the light brown jacket and the dark brown shirt, and he asks him if this is the shirt that he was wearing, and he goes, "I wouldn't be sure of that. It seemed to me that the other shirt was a bit darker," meaning the shirt that he was brought into the police department compared to the jacket that he was wearing was darker. So it was clearly never Oswald inside the book depository, ever. This is that picture again. William Seymour, he's got the receding hairline, he's thin, he looks just like Oswald. He looked enough like Oswald to where when Roger Craig sees him flee out the side of the book depository, which we're going to talk about now, that he identifies him as Oswald, and he thought it was the same guy he saw in the book depository. Remember, they weren't together and they weren't scrutinized, but he describes him as wearing the light brown. He thought it was a light brown shirt, but it's obviously this jacket here. Roger Craig, interesting guy. It seemed like he was on the right side of everything, but I can't really determine if he was telling the truth about a couple things that seemed to conflict with some of my other research. But William Seymour looked enough like Oswald to where he could pass for him. And so later, William Seymour and Lawrence Howard will be seen getting on a CIA plane next to an aqueduct flying out of Dallas. This is testified to by a guy named Robert Vinson, who was on that plane. So really interesting stuff. This is the best part for me. The delay in the timeline, as per Robert McNeil's phone call to New York, timestamping it at 12:36, makes perfect sense, because it indicates that they cut this guy loose on the third or fourth floor wearing the light brown jacket very close to 12:40 p.m. Very close, 12:39 most likely. They cut him loose because he's identified as an employee. The two of them continue up to the roof. This person, William Seymour, who is impersonating Oswald at this point, he goes down the stairs. He leaves outside the side door of the book depository, and he comes down the hill where he's seen by Roger Craig and a guy named Marvin Robinson. Then he gets into a light green Nash Rambler station wagon, and that's the light green Nash Rambler that Roger Craig will eventually say he saw a Negro driving, right? Let me see if I got any notes on that. This is the statement from Marvin Robinson. Yeah, this is him talking to Jim Garrison. This is pretty interesting. I had several meetings with Jim Garrison. He showed me numerous pictures taken in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 63. Among them was a picture of a Latin male. I recognized him as being the same man I had seen driving the Rambler station wagon, in which I had seen Oswald leave the book depository area. I was surprised, and I asked Jim who the man was. He didn't know. You know, Jim Garrison doesn't have a file on Lawrence Howard, William Seymour, or Loran Hall, but he knows exactly who those guys are, which tells me Garrison's files were basically robbed. We don't have all of them. Jim didn't know, but he said this man was arrested in Dealey Plaza immediately after the assassination, but was released because he didn't speak English. So this is the photograph he's talking about. So one on the left. I don't know when this exactly happened. I mean, what are the odds of him coming out the back door, getting stopped by a cop who, it was probably D.V. Harkness, the Dallas cop who was definitely in on the tramp stuff. But what are the odds that he would have a photographer with him at that exact moment? So this photograph makes no sense to me. It's clearly a photograph of a disheveled Lawrence Howard. We clearly have the statement that somebody got arrested and let go because they spoke Spanish. I can't fit this into the timeline anywhere. I just don't understand it whatsoever. But it's clear, and it would back up my version of the story, right? It backs up the idea that Lawrence Howard was inside the book depository and got stopped, photographed, and let go. But even though that would back up my story, I have no idea where to fit this into the timeline. Now, this is going to be the last thing we cover before I get to Oswald. The light green Nash Rambler takes off from Dealey Plaza. Inside the vehicle are Lawrence Howard driving. It's got William Seymour in there, Loran Hall, and Sergio Arcacha. There's 4 people in the vehicle. The vehicle will be seen by Roger Craig turning off, going towards Oak Cliff. John Armstrong actually comments on that. But the thing John Armstrong missed was that the vehicle will stop somewhere at a safe house, I'm presuming, because 3 of the guys in the car will get out, and William Seymour will be left alone with the vehicle. William Seymour will then drive the vehicle to the Tidy Lady Laundry, where he is seen, and people believe him to be, it says right here, Mr. Pennington related that his parents, Mr. and Mrs. J.W. Pennington, who reside with him at the above address, observed an individual who they now believe to have been Lee Harvey Oswald. It says shortly after noon, but it was really 12:50. So they identify William Seymour inside this laundromat as Oswald. He goes inside, he uses the phone, he speaks in Mexican, they say, and then he leaves south on North Clinton Street, but he leaves the light-colored Rambler station wagon in the parking lot, right? Then shortly after this, him and Lawrence Howard will be picked up by the CIA in a CIA plane next to the aqueduct, and Loran Hall, I presume, will go pick up the vehicle and drive it back to Los Angeles. So those are the events that basically lead up to the shooting of J.D. Tippit, which is a huge story in and of itself that you and I will cover another time. Mm-hmm. But that's basically the mechanics of what went down inside Dealey Plaza, inside the book depository, with the shooters who I've already named. And, you know, from there, they created the legend, perpetuated the legend of Oswald, and brought us to where we are today. So
let me go ahead, chat. If you guys got any questions, let's see if we have any questions. Then we can go into Oswald here, because we did a whole. And thank you so much, Cory, for that thorough explanation. I mean, that's a lot. I'll be honest with you guys. I know some of you guys are probably like, "Holy shit, that's a lot." This like blows my mind. Like, what are you talking about? Body doubles? Who are these shooters? So, well, if I'm not mistaken, we got what? Dave Ferrie, Lawrence Howard.
Yep.
We got Seymour.
Yep.
We got Jake.
Well, Seymour's not a shooter. He's just kind of a spotter, I would call him.
Okay, so Jack Valenti.
Yep. Loran Hall. Sergio Arcacha, who's on the roof of the depository, and Emilio Santana, like who I said got arrested in Dealey Plaza, and he's captured in that.
So
we
got
photo.
5 or 6 shooters?
You know, I calculate, I've put 9 people in place, but I can't say. Danny Green was there behind the pergola. I don't know if he shot, but he was there. He was a sniper trainer in the Marines, and now he's behind the pergola in the Kennedy assassination. It would make sense, but I can't put a rifle in his hand, nor can I say if it fired anything. Same thing with Robert Bernard Baker, who was on the overpass. I can't say with certainty if he shot. I don't think he did. It wouldn't make any sense for him to have. But there were witnesses who did say that they saw a rifle on the overpass, and Robert Bernard Baker was there. So, you know, when I have in place, I have 9 people in place. I can say with certainty 6 of them shot.
So we would say 9 people involved, and we can assume 4 to 5 shooters. But 9 people
yes,
involved.
I would say 6 tops. 6 tops.
All right. Let me see here. Anybody got any questions? One guy says a lot of bullshit, no evidence. Are you fucking stupid? He would just put out all the evidence there with literally with timestamps. People are stupid. Fucking, you're talking to a guy that studied this guys for the better part of 6 years, and knows almost every intricate detail. Looked at almost every document on this case. So, and there's someone's saying here, summarize in Hellcat terms. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, someone said that. Okay, can you debunk this real quick? Because people are so stupid. They say JFK getting headshot by a driver or getting headshot by one of the Secret Service agents.
Right. Okay. The reason that came about was because the original Zapruder film was such a bad quality that there is a reflection off the head of the guy in the passenger seat, who's what, Emery Roberts. And so, or no, that was Samuel Kinney. So there was a reflection of light off his head, right? And that's it. It looks like as he's turning around, the reflection, he turns around, he moves his arm, the reflection off the top of the head happens, and then he turns back around, the reflection goes away. It was clearly not him. And then see, this is one of those look to the left while we fooled you to the right kind of things, because the driver, and I didn't go into this because it's just an unnecessary, superfluous mention, but the driver was involved in the driver of the Kennedy assassination. It was William Greer. Witnesses saw him pull over and pick someone up on the other side of the knoll. So my opinion is he picked up Jack Valenti. And then the cars proceed to do this like swap. They kind of leapfrog around each other. And that gave the limousine a chance to slow down. And then Jack Valenti goes to the other side of the Secret Service car where he's captured in McIntyre photo number 2. This is really apparent in McIntyre photo number 1. I just don't go into it very often because it opens up a world of questions and problems and probabilities that will take too much time for me to wade through. So, sure. But this was as much of anything else a ritual. This was a demonstration of power. This was Jack Valenti had to get into the president's limousine to send the biggest message he ever sent. And he didn't send it to Kennedy because he was dead. He sent it to history. He sent it to us and Lyndon Johnson.
What was Jack Valenti's motivation to kill the president?
Because he's a soldier and he does what he's told. Okay. That's it. He works for the CIA. Yeah. I have a document that proves he works for the CIA because he was working down in, he goes into the military in World War II. He gets out. He goes to Harvard Business School where he directly connects to Kissinger. But I'm pretty convinced that he was already in intelligence by the time he got to Kissinger. I'm convinced he was an undercover OSS guy who didn't do bombing missions but did some sort of assassinations during the war. He gets out and he applies to Harvard Business School. They reject him. Well, that doesn't stop him. He ends up going up there for a weekend, getting with the dean of the school. Next thing you know, he's in an advanced honors program. And he graduates in like 18 months when it should have taken two and a half years. Mm-hmm. So he gets coddled after, this is like 1946, 1947. So after the war, he's already made his connections through Kissinger or whoever. And he gets everything he ever wants for the rest of his life. So he obviously gets recruited into intelligence and does what he's told the whole time. Remember, he worked for Humble Oil. He worked for guys like he worked with George de Mohrenschildt. He worked directly with Prescott and George Bush when he was as young as 15 years old. So he was groomed from a very young age. Mm-hmm. Add to that his mob connections through Trafficante, who's connected to, the CIA through Mayu and Johnny Roselli, right? And you got a happy family and nurturing a guy, grooming him his whole life. And that's who Jack Valenti was. And I think that's why he was picked. Because he was groomed his whole life and he was connected to all the right people. And then he was rewarded with Hollywood afterward. Okay. And the rest is history, literally.
All right. And guys, some of you guys are wondering about the book. The book is called A Warning from History, guys. I got it off Amazon. You can go ahead and get it off Amazon as well. Go support Cory. The book is way more detailed. Obviously, we're summarizing a lot of the things here for you guys, but the long story short is this. The Warren Commission, guys, was a lie. I'll go ahead and summarize for you guys. Okay, because Cory went over a lot of details there, but this is what you needed, some of the takeaways for some of you guys that are just joining or whatever. And we're going to put timestamps, by the way, as well. Don't worry, guys. The long story short is this. The Warren Commission was a lie. It was headed up by Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA at the time. Obviously, he has an incentive to cover it up because Kennedy wanted to disband the CIA. On top of that, he also had been funded/assisted by the U.S. By the mafia to become the president of the United States. His dad had made some promises that Kennedy didn't necessarily want to fulfill, and there's also an Israeli connection that we didn't even touch yet, right? So a lot of people wanted Kennedy dead. So what ended up happening was you got a bunch of contractors or people that have affiliations with the CIA. Two of these individuals that were involved in this conspiracy looked just like Oswald and had been doing things since 1947 to kind of put themselves in
So
positions.
61, I would put the modern, because this is two different phases. We'll talk about the first phase coming up, but all these impersonations are a second phase of impersonations. And the reason I believe Oswald was picked was because he was most certainly some form of intelligence operative going back to 47, where the anomalies in his life begin. So
Gotcha. So these two individuals that look like him, basically what they did was they staged a bunch of situations where people might not necessarily know that it was Oswald himself, but they thought it was Oswald because they looked like him, had certain mannerisms, etc. Whether it's staging a fight, doing criminal activity, whatever it is, getting people, witnesses seeing him in play. But one of the biggest things, right, especially with like the J.D. Tippit thing, which I'll just use as an example, they said that Oswald killed the cop, but the reality is that the guy that killed the cop wasn't Oswald. It was it Seymour or was it?
it was Kerry Thornley.
It was Kerry Thornley that killed the
Kerry
cop.
Thornley we'll talk about in my upcoming presentation, because Kerry Thornley was most certainly involved with Oswald in the Marines. He knew Oswald in the Marines, and everything he did in the Marines, if you ask me, was about setting Oswald up later, which all started to occur in 1960. What year? Well, that would have been 1959, right? So the gathering of information on Oswald, I don't know why it really occurred in the first place, because it was way before the assassination, but it was sometime around 1960, late 62, early 63, when he was repurposed. All the stuff he had done before was about perpetuating this communist persona to get into Cuba, if you ask me. He was trying to get into Cuba as an operative, but they repurposed him, I think a big part because he brought back Marina, who was a Russian spy, right? So,
and the other thing too, I think that's very important for people to realize is before Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby, he even said himself, "I didn't do this. I'm the patsy. Like I didn't do this." Like he's like dumbfounded. Like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, I didn't fucking shoot the president. And it makes sense because from what you're saying, Cory, Oswald wasn't even there. He was.
Exactly.
And we're going to talk about this. I don't want to get too ahead because you're going to explain all this. Actually, matter of fact, we might cut to Rumble because Tommy Sotomayor wants to come on and ask some questions as well. He's a good friend of mine, loves the Kenny stuff. He's blown away right now by what you're saying because he studied this as well, and I told him that I was going to have you on. And I'll get him in on the Zoom call as well. But yeah, I mean, any other questions, guys? Let me look at the chat here. Guys, if you got any questions, fnfsuperchat.com or Rumble Rant In or Castle Club. Oh, I see some chats in Castle Club. Let me read these. Fuck them boys. Okay. Doge Trollster, I see what you're saying. Middle finger, even more offensive people on the internet. And then Adam Russell said WNF. So Doge Trollster, shout out to you and Adam Russell. Okay. And then let me look here and see if there's anything else. Someone said, did LBJ know about this? He answered that earlier. No, he did not.
I don't believe he did.
Yeah, Jack Valenti just kind of did it and then was on. That's crazy that he's on Air Force One watching the LBJ get sworn in with Jackie Kennedy there with blood all over her dress.
I can't prove it yet, but I'm convinced Jack Valenti shot Martin Luther King.
Really?
Thus, I haven't even gotten to I don't even want to get into my reasons why, because that'll open a can of worms and we'll be here for hours. So, but no, I have enough circumstantial evidence to make me believe that. It needs follow up and all that, but there's enough circumstantial evidence that tells me that that's exactly what happened.
Interesting. Okay. Let me see here. Anything else before we get into the? Okay, I guess we'll get into Oswald.
All right.
And I said I got like another 30 to 40 minutes.
30, 40 minutes? All right, that's going to be a crunch, but I'll do my best. So,
because we've been going now for about 2 hours.
I could probably do it in an hour. So here we go. Let's get started. We're going to explore Oswald's early life. And in doing that, we are going to address the work of a guy named John Armstrong, who's dead now. He died in 2020. He spent much of his life digging into the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. And he ultimately came to the conclusion that Oswald growing up was part of some sort of intelligence operation, meant to get a spy into the Soviet Union. And it involved Oswald having a duplicate. And based on the evidence, it looks like this started to occur sometime around 1947. All these pictures here are comparatives of men who Armstrong believed were two different men. And as we go through this presentation, what sounds ridiculous at first will not be so ridiculous and will really kind of give you a peek into what the intelligence community was doing, even as far back as 47. But I'm going to tell you with certainty, when you consider naval intelligence has been around since like the 1800s, they've been doing ops like this for way longer than the CIA. So, the official story on Oswald, which is mostly true from what I gather, is that his father, Robert Edward Lee Oswald, married Marguerite Frances Claverie, and they had 2 children, Robert Oswald Jr. and Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, Miss Oswald had another son named John Pick, who was she had basically 3 kids from 3 different dads, or 2 different dads and John Pick, right? So she got around a bit. She was also married to a guy named Ekdahl for a while. So she had 3 husbands and ends up with 3 children. And so we'll get to John Pick later because he plays an important role in exposing some of this. One thing I found very unusual about both of these is that all these people lived in New Orleans, right? Marguerite and Robert lived in New Orleans. He dies in 39, by the way, and he's out of the picture.
And just so
he never meets
the audience
Oswald.
know, so we're basically going over Oswald's life, and we're going to go over how this body double thing came to play, right?
Right. And we're going to kind of pass a determination on whether or not this is a legitimate, path of research or not. So, but you see all these brothers and sisters that they have, that's like 11, right? And none of these people ever had any contact with Marguerite Oswald, Robert Oswald, or Lee Oswald after their brother died, after Robert Oswald Sr. died. So there's something going on there. For some reason, the family's out of the picture entirely, even though at times they lived right up the road. So that I find very strange. The only relative they had any contact with is Lillian Claverie Moret, who ends up being married to Charles Dutz Moret, who worked for Carlos Marcello, right? Kind of a part-time mobster. He ran the numbers games in New Orleans, but that's the only family member on either side that they had any contact with. So between 1939 and 1959, Lee Harvey Oswald and Marguerite Oswald, and it's mostly just the 2 of them because the 2 brothers, after the late 40s and 50s, they go off and they join the Marines. And so they're kind of out of the picture. And even before that, they're off at boarding school and stuff. So mostly it's just Marguerite Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald. And so this is like the list that the Warren Commission says that they lived at, leading up to 63. This is completely false. The list I've come up with has over 40 addresses on it. And I've even got a couple more that I haven't even added to this yet. But when you start to dig into this, these 2 addresses I was able to sort and figure out a legitimate timeline for because that was kind of complicated. But all this other stuff in red doesn't make any sense. Either it's not in the official records or there's a major overlap where Oswald is seen living at multiple places at times by different witnesses who are very confident about what they've seen. So the first anomaly in addresses occurs in 1947. So
and real quick,
Marguerite,
Cory, I'm gonna bring Tommy in. We got Tommy Sotomayor in the house. I'm gonna get off of YouTube. So guys, do me a favor. We're covering. We're also probably might hit a little bit of the Israeli connection as well. But guys, come on over to rumble.com/freshandfit. We're gonna finish the stream on over there. So come on over, ninjas. I'm gonna end the stream on YouTube, on both YouTube channels. I'll drop the link for y'all real fast. Let me drop the Rumble link in the chat for you guys. Come on over. Bear with me, guys, while I'm just dropping a link in here for everybody. All right, link is there, guys. Join the Rumble stream right now. I'm going to end the YouTube stream pretty much. I'll stay up on X as well, but ending the YouTube streams. Come on over, guys, rumble.com/freshfit. Love you guys on YouTube, but it ends here. We're going to